small town of Olympia. Actually, it's ancient Olympia is what it's really called, and not jammed with tourists yet. Lively in the evening, and the main sites are up at the end of the street. Okay, coming across that bridge, you enter the area where the Archaeological Museum is, and there where the archaeological site is. We'll go to the museum first. The History Museum is closed. So this is the outside of the Archaeological Museum. The design's simple and minimally maintained, but it gives us an idea of what a stoa might have looked like. These columns are rather small compared to the columns we've seen for most stoas, but gives us a sense of it. From the cella of Philipion, not sure if it was in which temple it was in. Obviously a circular feature. Apparently it was a semicircular podium that had also a depiction of Philip of Macedonia. I think it's Philip II of Macedonia, and his wife and his son Alexander the Great. Looks like the best of the preserved detail by that renowned sculptor. The base of a circular water basin. This is a marble capital from some other place, Elia or something. But what is curious is that it's hollowed out as a bowl, and there's a hole for water to escape through. I'm not sure that any of this is from this area, but small-scale relief. Looks like we can detect some of the paint. Red paint there, as you see. Looks like a gray or may have been a black colored paint with a little tinge of red. A Doric capital. This columns and their pedestals doesn't seem to indicate that it came from here. Column is 4th century. And this is also 4th century. And this is 3rd century. 1st century statue of Vespasian, a military commander. Reflects a lot of the realism and movement. Don't think we're seeing much of what we haven't seen already in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, except that this is a rather huge statue. Haven't seen anything of this dimension yet. It says it's a 1st century BC marble of August. I don't know if that means Augustus, but I'd say that's probably about 5 feet across at the shoulders. You wonder to what degree did these statues reflect the people, and of course that probably is dependent upon which of the artistic eras we're talking about. We're going to follow the scheme of this outline. We've gone from the entrance here. We're now in room number 1, and we'll just rotate around as it shows it here. This room, as I do a spin tour, is of the prehistoric period at Olympia, ranging from the late Neolithic to the Mycenaean times. We'll take a closer look at this to see if we can find some interesting anomalies, but not duplicate what they have here. Model of the large tumulus of Philipion, dating from the EH 2 to 3 periods, whatever that means. And that must mean the early Helladic or Hellenist period, which I think the Hellenist period might have been 350 to 300 BC. Here you just see the various elevations or stratigraphy that the archaeologists have sought. Well, I think those turquoise little dots represent the full outline of that wall. It's fascinating to imagine what a virtual reality digital version of this in 3D would be, where you could actually look down into different levels and see virtual reality lifestyles in play or in action. These are some of the artifacts found in those lower stratigraphy levels. The beginnings of pottery were as revolutionary in its time as anything in our technological age is today, or is to today. Don't think of it as just a bunch of quaint little pieces of utensil. Interesting vessel. It actually is a censer, C-E-N-S-E-R, used for smoking out the bees. Very early and very crude stone implements. Imagine the skill and the time involved to drill that hole in that stone. Early attempts by the artist to ice designs into a surface. These little conical shaped things are called aorstite cannuli, whatever that means. This is a Mycenaean chamber tomb in current condition. Again, notice that trapezoidal formation there. Again, would have been a grave utensil called engraved stirrup jars. I don't think that's the correct word. Rather, I think they are seals. These are made out of hammered bronze, and I'll show you a artist's depiction of what's being portrayed here. It doesn't seem to say what they're for, although these were used at some point to clothe a statue, apparently. But here's what we're looking at. They've hammered in the texture detail of the garments, as well as the hair. Next panel is a popular motif of the lion. The bull looking quite powerful as opposed to the state we see them in at the Acropolis Museum when the lion has attacked them and they are subdued and so pitiful. Very beautiful bird-like creatures, which may be called the Sphinx, I'm not sure. So these are Assyrian, found in the Stadion century, but reused by Greece in the second quarter of the 7th century BC. Enter room 2, dominated initially by little figurines. These are the legs of some of the tripods that I think were used alongside statues of athletes, all parts of geometric bronze tripods. They're the handles of cauldrons, apparently that were placed on the tripod in this fashion. Now we want to try to find out what was put in the cauldrons. I wonder what technique was used, if there's a lost wax for this. We have an idea of how the handles and the cauldron and the legs work together. These figurines here are from the cauldron handles. Look at that one. So they would have sat up on top of a cauldron handle like that little horse does. See that the wings represent how that handle was attached to the cauldron. So that makes some kind of sense. This indicates that the cauldrons also had these other attachments. These guys right here. So these were pretty impressive. Here's the remains of a reasonably intact one. They would have sat up there just like statues do for all the world to revel in. It's interesting to think these were just abandoned after Christianity knocked out the Olympic Games for being too associated with paganism, I guess, which it itself is riddled with the icons of, not to mention the practices of. So what, if anything, went into cauldrons? These clay votives offerings and little tripod votive offerings. How cute. Isn't that particularly nice? Rather rough, don't they? Big always being better. Bronze winged female character. But notice, is that not really the archaic smile? Seemingly something else. But what were the eyes made of? Apparently just fittings for bronze utensils of various sorts. Back section of a bronze cuirass with incise decorations. How dramatic it might have looked when it was fresh and burnished. The reconstruction of an archaic shield, and apparently this is where you put your arm. Various defensive equipment devices for the arm, the leg, neck, apparently. Huh. Their equivalent of our Kevlar. Slowly walk down here. The kids are coming, the noise will increase. But look at the different styles. You can be sure that Hollywood's been here. You wonder how effective bronze was. Mainly 6th and 5th BC century metalwork and pottery. We'll just kind of cruise down through it. Notice it seems to be more substantial, but also more detailed and more carefully achieved. I mean that in an artistic sense. Remains of that, not much identifiable. From different buildings in the sanctuary, but it's interesting how they've taken the original and put them into place on the reconstruct here, so we have an idea of what it might have looked like. What I think is interesting are the colors, particularly that background color. Pretty piece from the 4th century. BC. ideal tour group where you can hardly hear the guide. Everybody's listening. 5th century statue is interesting because of the detail of that piece of garment overlaying the torso. This somehow seems inherently unfair. This is a model of Phiedias' workshop. Phiedias was the sculptor of the Apollo on the Acropolis also. This is the famous statue of Hermes, Hermes, carved by Praxiteles in the 4th century BC. Depicts the god carrying the infant Dionysus to his nurses in Boeotia. What's noted is the perfect polish of the Heraion marble. We're now in room number 10, devoted to the Nymphaion the Etc. of Herodes Atticus. These are statues of the family of Herodes Atticus that adorn the 2 stories of this monument. And then the marble bull dedicated by Regula in the sanctuary of Zeus, probably a statue of Marcus Aurelius. So this is 2nd century AD. That means Roman. Is they're copying the Greeks at their best. Notice how beautifully it seems, as a layman, that this robes flow across the parts of the body. How does an artist imagine and then execute this kind of stuff? He was pointing out tools that were used by the ancients and suggests, although I can't identify it, that many of these tools are the same tools used today for the same kind of functions, indicating how similar were those eras versus today. And somewhat answers the question that the archaeologist and I discussed about some of the major sweeps of doing is panning through this just for the record. There's nothing much you can do with it. I might just luck out here. And it was here athletes trained for the events. And perhaps the Stoas were places where they changed clothes, kept equipment, blah, blah, blah. And the need is to stand in a place where so much of it is extant, where the columns still stand as they originally were. I don't even think these things have been restored to the position, but probably always were here. So you really do get a sense for the first time of the dimensions and somewhat of the dimensions vertically as well as horizontally. And notice all of this complex area that I'm standing in now was surrounded by some kind of a wall. Well, we can see it. Some kind of a pedestal, because you can see that there's a little bit of writing remaining on it. And apparently the weather comes from the left, not the right, because that's still protected somewhat. There are the holes in the top of the column to hold the statue or whatever it was on top in place. Here's the space we're standing in. What it would have looked like, so that all those columns actually were the support for a covered cloister, if you will. Not to mention those two buildings on either side of that. That's what that outer wall is a wall of one of those buildings. Hearing a hum of bees, it's because these trees are filled with them. So pretty, so tranquil. The fun of it will walk as though we were inside the Stoa, between these columns, and try to imagine that we're looking out to the left into this open space, which apparently had columns for some reason. Maybe the rooms in that one of those two buildings that ran on either side of that large square. It was something different here, an archway for some purpose. Well, I don't know if it was an archway or not, but it's not columns. Those seats, that's the forum. We've seen them before. In particular, might have been a room where people gathered to chat, or maybe it was a waiting room for something else. But imagine, imagine if you can, on a crowded day for whatever took place, all the people sitting here chatting, and then being quiet when someone had something to say. Just to show you where we've been, we started right here, and then we walked down along this side here of the Palaistra. Here are the baths that we looked at. This is where Phiedias' workshop is. This is the Leonidaion, or whatever that's called. And now we're back here, and we're going to go over this way. What must have been a beautiful building, although I'm not sure it isn't prettier now where you can see all of the columns. But where those kids were standing is where I first was shooting about, and then walked from right to left down between those columns and up along there. In here is supposed to be this Philipion, a rectangular building with a peristyle courtyard. Peristyle meaning surrounded by or inundated by columns, of which we can see a ton of remnant columns here. But notice how terribly worn they are. It might have been the entranceway into, one of the main entranceways into that Palaistra. Rounded base that we saw over there, or at least the little curved walled round area, might have been one of those circular temples, although there was no evidence of columns there. There's Leonidas. Somewhere right in here should be the baths, but I can't tell from this map where precisely, whether it's this right here or whether it's over where those people are, but we'll wander. Oh, these are Greek baths, so no surprise then where the Romans got the design. In fact, this is the 5th to the 1st century, so we're representing here a large 4th century evolutionary growth of these. Swimming pool. Looking at baths, of course, we're looking for some indication of that function, and there it is right there. That floor covered by those columns of brick, if you will, that are spaced apart a bit to allow the steam or the hot air to flow underneath those floors. That indicates the bath. Now, I don't know if the Greeks used a similar system, but that's certainly a Roman system. We have another look underneath this floor. It's circular, I don't know what that implies. We should have hot tubs, if you will, as well as cold plunges. That would have been normal. Places to sit and relax. Maybe places for minor athletic things, like an athletic wrestling room or something like that. Also, there was usually, for the Romans, a little room that did sell drinks. It was just pretty much like our spas, if you will. Now, how extensive from this vantage point. Remember, there's the Palaistra that we were in. Were these baths? I don't know. There's a Roman section here. Maybe that was what this was. Right here, a later version, of course. Interesting for me to learn that connection. With still mosaic floors intact. I don't know if we'll see those. There's no evidence here of that. Oftentimes they're either removed or, which may be the case, notice the plastic sticking out. They may have excavated them, restored whatever they needed to, or repaired whatever they needed to, stabilized, etc. Covered it all up with plastic, covered it over with sand. I've seen that. That way it's protected, and in the future, when archaeologists choose to, for whatever the reason, they can uncover it. Reconstruction of it, they apparently had really giant ants too. What we notice is that the columns are built of different size or different thickness stones, and not necessarily square, whereas the Romans almost consistently built them with thinner bricks, and all of the same size. In here stood the workshop of Phiedias that we saw a model of. But I don't think it was this spot. This was something different here. You'll notice it's a circular ring there for some reason. This is just a wandering mob. There's nothing going on here. But the teacher will scramble for her guidebook, and then for those who are closest to her, she will read from it. So at least 5 or 6 kids will listen, and probably 50 to 60% of those kids won't. Have a good analog of the colossal waste of energy of most field trips, because the teacher is not invested any time in figuring out how to control such a thing. You see, they're just wandering. I mean, there's not even a teacher around. This large building here was the Leonidaion, built in 330 BC by Leonidas of Naxos, and was used as a guest house for official visitors to the sanctuary. So we'll roam around and take a look at that. Other structures not defined on the map. Notice this wall treatment, interesting, particularly if it's original. One of the few times I've seen anyone use small stones to decorate what looks like just an ordinary wall, but that may not be the case. Closely the design, a horizontal line at the very bottom, 2 maybe, then a course of stone, horizontal course of stone, but with another thin stone separating each of the stones, and almost a chevron shape it's creating there for the next 2 stone courses, and then back to a double course of thin stones. This was of large base stones and then brick. So if this had columns, and it looks like it did, 1, 2, 3.
No, I've had enough of it.
So this is probably the dramatic living room center, quite high.
Ups and downs.
I'll go downstairs and look at that other room. Again, a dramatic interior, eh? And for guests, you wonder how many were intended to be here. Reminds me more of a church with that circular area at the end down there, or a basilica, but that being a place for a temple of some sort, I mean an altar. And maybe that was the case, maybe there was an altar. Some of the detail of the base and the capitals of some of the columns here. This might have been a very elegant room. Look at the detail on that column. It's the first time I've seen a column that's had detail put into it. They were normally either plain or fluted, period. So that's novel. This was 330, which I think puts it in the most advanced stage of Greek art. These had inscriptions on each of the bases. A closer look at the detail on those columns. Only this column, and maybe all those, are not round. They're oblong, much thinner here. So that's another novelty. Huh. Now there we can see that. This treatment here, almost like an iconoclast, or iconostase, excuse me, found in the Byzantine churches at 330 BC. I don't know, that wouldn't have been Byzantium, which was 600 years later, but let's get a little bit closer and look at that. And notice that round circle has detail inscribed on it. And then I suspect that the walls, and look at the size of the stones in those arched windows, I suspect that they were all plastered and painted. Probably the floors were a mosaic. I'm not sure to what degree the Greeks used mosaics, though, so it may have just been that neatly arranged pebble stone surface. Fine quality stone used as a threshold. And again, you can see the hole over there just underneath that metal framing for the doors to pivot in. Track past those kids and go across to the right behind the Palaistra. About where my thumbnail is, the tip of it, as you can see it from the camera, and we're looking at number 23, which is, we'll go back and look at that right now while the kids go in another direction. This was the Temple of Zeus, the most important building in Altus, a Doric peripheral building with 6 by 13 columns, 470 to 456 BC. Cella stood Phiedias' masterpiece, the Crescept elephantine statue of Zeus. I think that means gold and ivory, I think. The most famous sculptural compositions from the pediments are on display in the Olympia Museum. This little arch was for, and was it actually taller or deeper than this? Of the Gymnasium. Apparently this is where they worked out here, I guess. Although, I think that's the Gymnasium here. And this is the Palaistra that we were looking at. And there the Temple of Zeus, I think. Okay, I'm back almost where I started. I started up on that hill where that couple is on the left and panned down into this archaeological site, where the man is still sitting in the chair. Must be the chief archaeologist. That's where my thumbnail is. The left side of it, as you see it, it's in the left of number 22 at that intersection. Behind us, and the Palaistra ahead of us up there, where all the beautiful trees are. That's still part of the Gymnasium right there, I think. And this is where we're going to pursue now. This is the Kronion Thermae, 2nd century BC, 5th century AD. This had baths of the Hellenistic period with impressive mosaics, were constructed in Roman times, destroyed by an earthquake at the end of the 3rd century AD. A place for agricultural activity, I don't know what that means. Remnant of a couple of columns, so they certainly played a role. This was probably the entrance here, and that might have been somewhat dramatic. We're looking in on 21, I believe. If you look closely, I think that one section of a wall just beyond this section to our right here, I'm going to close in on it. There's the section to our right. I want to be right back there in the center. I think I see a curvature there. But that wall is curved. In that area, 21, called the Philipion. And the Philipion circular building begun by Philip II, king of Macedonia, after the Battle of Chaeronea, 338 BC, and completed by his son Alexander the Great, housed 5 statues of Alexander and his forefathers by the sculptor Leonidaion. This even right here up close in an area I don't know what these buildings, this structure was, is also a little bit of a circular feature. So again, we guess. And forget everything I just said about that other site, because that wasn't it. But everything I did say about it applies to this. This is the Philippidon. Notice those massive blocks there that probably held those statues. So this was probably a very dramatic building. Circular with columns all the way around. May have even had that curious beehive dome on it. Just had a regular kind of a roof on it. Beautiful. This would be the Temple of Hera. Probably pretty impressive in its day. There's the cella. Notice that the column, unless it's been reconstructed, made out of pieces that went into drums, but those may be restorations. A curious thing. How fragile this stone is, how easily it wears, becomes porous. Must be limestone. Who knows what price it's paid for the pollution that may be in wafting through the atmosphere in Greece. Might have been where the propylon was, as most temples had. Number 17, the Nymphaion, That looks like one of those cupolas down there. The base for it near the 2 columns, presumably the same thing was right to our right on this pedestal here. They're hollowed out, I think I can see from here. For the bases for some of the lower floors statues, but out of that wall and maybe those little square holes we see, I don't think so. It should have been the water tumbling, and then water tumbling from this level up here too into here. But what were these things? I didn't see them in the drawing. These were pools that collected the water coming off the first higher tier, and then that water poured out through these lions' heads. Wow, that was pretty spiff, wasn't it? The Romans were into water features because they had them in Rome from the huge amounts of waters the aqueducts brought in, but it was a technology they'd refined. It would have looked like. Those are the treasury buildings behind it. Up here were the treasuries, if I can interpret the map correctly. You see the bases for the individual buildings. You wonder who came here to store their offerings in their treasury houses versus those at Delphi. And notice the columns there. What was that a part of all this? Proceed out of this area, the Atlas, through what was called the crypt, that vaulted passageway, if you will, to the stadium. Proceed out of this area, the Atlas, through what was called the crypt, that vaulted passageway, if you will, to the stadium. Pretty much how the stadium looked. It was not seats like the Pan-Athenic Stadium in Athens, but were these slopes that held approximately 45,000 people. And this is where it all happened. Get a look at the starting blocks, and if you notice, they're incised so they slide back this way to give you your toe hole right there on that vertical surface. And then it looks like there would have been some kind of device right here that came up, unless that was just how it locked these stones together. Little promontory apparently stood the exedra, whatever that is, of Leonidaion. You can see it right there. What that platform would look like. And then opposite, on that platform, if it was, would have been the altar of the goddess Demeter, Shamain. Here, the little drainage disc designed to keep the water, probably from the slopes running downhill there, and probably through some drainage system out of this complex. Some modern Greeks. Except that women were not only not allowed to participate, they weren't even allowed to watch. But you know they did. They snuck up in the trees. Some of them did. Would have been the entrance, or the exit, if you will, if you're coming from that direction, with a long colonnade. These indentations were for, was it simply erosion, or was there something attached to those? Against that wall were the 16 bases for the statues of the athletes that, gets this, were the ones who cheated during the games. And they were then forced to, quote unquote, dedicate the statues they placed here. Now what they were of, I don't know, but they were placed here by them. Oftentimes, remember, only athletes could be freeborn Greeks, and oftentimes that might mean from wealthy families. Here is the Stoa number 10, the Echo Stoa, or the Heptachos, which separates the Altus from the stadium. Built in 350 BC. Doesn't say what it was for. It's okay. You can see some columns there. Stoa was this whole area that you see here going that way. Now what role and what this particular unique looking feature was, who knows. You wonder what these were for. Were there special statues here or monuments here? Probably. Everything from where that man is standing all the way down through here, all the way down to where the woman is, who's actually one of the monitors here with the backpack she's adjusting right now. In the middle of that is that Stoa. But they had some interesting features. It wasn't just a whole pile of columns, unless they were in all that section back in there, and this stood out in front of it somehow. So when it comes to important bases, or important anything, they used very good stone that could be carved and preserved, and it did, generally. Again, here's the corner of the Stoa, so you can see how long that was. This was one doozy of a building, and with this probable drainage ditch right here. What this area down here is that we're going to visit. Elaborate mosaics. You wonder where those are today. I can only imagine how rich this building was. Not to mention the grounds surrounding it. Right now we're standing just about at the end of number 9 in the lower left, if you will. Looking at this end of the Temple of Zeus, and we'll go over and explore that now. Not quite at the temple yet. So I don't know what these were for, these buildings. These for drainage. And then you wonder what this was for. So notice a little knob on the left, there's one been knocked off on the right. But the indentation, was this always the orientation of the stone? Perhaps like that over there, that larger pedestal. So maybe this held something like a statue or whatever. All these are bases of statues. Kind of like going through a cemetery, but it wasn't. Stone might have been in that orientation. It might have been for some kind of platform for a statue, kind of like that larger platform has the same indentation, it's just bigger. And these, of course, for statues. This one a rather large monument base. Same thing here. It's kind of like walking through a cemetery, except this was not a cemetery. And this is interesting because these protrusions suggest that there were other stones that were contiguous to them. Now these are tumbled down as though literally they just fell in place. Very large stones. Notice how they were worked. Example of one there. Strange because you can't tell whether it's an upturned base or a fallen capital. On the other hand, look at the size of these drums. These were huge columns. There would be a column right there in front of the entryway, which is interesting. But maybe it wasn't an entryway. Maybe these levels persisted all the way around the temple. When we finally visit the planets of intelligent, extraterrestrial, advanced life, will we find ruins from their cultures in the past? And will they be things that we can even recognize? Will they be in mediums that are familiar to us? Here, whatever it was circular. First of all, because of the white marble, I wonder where that came from, and then the triangular shape it looks like. Docent here tells me that this statue that's pictured on the back was what sat at the top of this monument. This complex that we're standing in, that we've been mulling about, is called the Circle of the Heroes. And on these pedestals that I'm so glibly skirting by quickly, and notice there's little alcoves that are also arched, were statues. And these were statues of the men who won the great competitions. Now, I can't imagine they had one for every year this whole thing operated, so you have to wonder who were the people who had statues here. The Muhammad Ali of boxing, Etsky of soccer, etc., etc. Said that the winners could not be compensated by either money or political position. So you have to ask yourself, what were they compensated with? Was it just that extreme high regard by society? Might be enough, but tell Elton John he can't have the money. I have a hint of that beautiful marble when it was new, kinda new, white. Hint at the fact that the outside also had a rim that was filled with statues. I don't know, I'm winging that one. You stand on this far side and you wonder what was inside of these, apparently a building made of these huge rocks. But the circle extended beyond that pillar. Imagine that in the past, the man who won the competition, and then he had this erected on his behalf, carved and erected. Just imagine that he stood where I'm standing with his family, and they admired this product of his achievement. What kind of satisfaction would he feel? The same that Muhammad Ali would feel at the end of one of his great fights. and that anyone else who achieves something great and gets public recognition would feel. Entire area enclosed by these large stones. Was it a wall? A high wall? There, the temple in the background. Another view of the temple. It occurred to me, when you see the waste of energy that is represented by these fallen stones, how magnificent it is that the works still remain of Michelangelo and others from old history. And it gives you an appreciation for any little artifact that we find from ancient history. This is best pronounced in French, but I don't know how to do it. And it was the council house. We saw one at Acropolis. In Athens at the ancient Agora. Both supposed to be models of the same. So why do they look so different? Maybe different eras. Picture and focus on the arch, because if we could identify where that portion was, we could identify the rest of this drawing of this, which looks to be compatible with this particular drawing. Wander through and see if we can find either of those two arched sections. An arch section. Could this be one of them? A straight section. If that's the case, then the arch would have gone like that. Then presumably there's either a lost one over here to the right, or another one over here to the left. We'll go see. Here's our answer. This would be the far left one. This would be the back of the left rectangle with the arch segment at the end. And here would be that rectangle. And there was that middle square building. So we're behind the building now. Its orientation in the drawing. The front of it would be up there, not where they put the sign. And there would be the other section. What would be back in here, I don't know. Now it's just a lapidarium for what has fallen and remained. Some additional buildings. It looks like the whole thing was surrounded by that kind of a wall with those kind of capstones on them. The Bouleyterion is number 7, right dead center. And notice that it's down below on this map from the Temple of Zeus. So panning up, there's the Temple of Zeus. You see where we're at. Was the south Stoa. You can see the position of the columns outlined. That's where you see number 8. This is interesting. Notice that what looks like a wall, but notice that it's actually uses older fragments of columns to build it. That's curious. Huh. Way over there is the Leonidaion, and between here and there, they're not telling us what any of all this rubble is. But I'm sure that would be an insult. That was my comment to the persons who built and had this built. Must be the remains of a well. Here, you wonder if this particular stonework has anything to do with it. It looks like a trough. I've often walked in canyons, particularly in the mountains of America, where you see huge blocks of stone that have fallen. And I've wondered, what did it sound like when they fell? What did it look like? What did it feel like? Did the earth rumble? Ask the same question. It looks like it probably happened at the same time, all of these columns falling. But who knows? Look at how those that have not yet fallen are still partially disrupted. What force would allow that to occur? An earthquake. Think of all the labor and the time it took to install those, and the time it took for it to fall. Yikes. Here, whatever this is, it looks like a series of pedestals for monuments of some sort. Imagine if those who built that one, who assembled that one, could know that theirs would be the one that would survive. See the rough outline of what this building was. Almost reminds you of a more recent monastery with all that brickwork, but then that brickwork was typical of a Roman aqueduct that I saw in Portugal, I believe. In fact, it may have been in Porto. No, it wasn't. We're walking out of one of its entrances and exits. Probably already obvious what we're about to encounter. Another structure somewhat like the Palaistra. At least one set of columns. I think there's an interior set of columns. The difference here is all of the interior buildings that existed in this complex. But if we go down and read the interpretive sign, guess what? Notice that this building was mostly covered, except for that interesting structure in the center. There's that structure today with the trees in it. Look over there, we can see that. We'll go take a closer look. That was the Leonidaion. This is the Leonidaion. Makes more sense. A large complex and dramatic to house important officials from all over the world of Greece. Imagine that here were rooms that the officials might occupy as they would a special suite in Washington, perhaps even in the White House, as well as support rooms for the cooking and other facilities that supported and impressed those people. Imagine they would exit their rooms into this colonnaded cloister-like arcade, if you will, that wraps around this curious interior feature with its, no doubt, water-filled feature, as well as in the center. Would there have been a statue? Would there have been a water feature of some sort, like a fountain? Did they have the technology for fountains? Could they swim in it? Did they? Were there ducks and so forth in it? Versailles, were there small boats that you could cruise around in? Seems silly, but on the other hand, quite a little extravagance for a guest house. Notice here the concentration of walls and therefore rooms, for whatever that implies. It's probably the grade and the size of those stones. I'm guessing that's the case. On here a waterway. Bring in the water for that feature and keep it fresh. Stones are off center for some reason. I wonder why. And why do they have those holes in them? Unless these were just brought from some other place, like a wall, and just installed here for some reason. The grade was. Are these original walls or something the government installed for some other purpose? That they are. There's a Leonidaion Thermae building. Perfect wall heating system. In the 6th century it was converted to a wine distillation place and then a glass manufacturing. Interesting also is the use of the material for design elements. See the wall heating system they're talking about. No doubt heat rose up through there from down below and circulated maybe in there like almost like a tube, like a refrigerator's coil system. Notice that, all those cavities that were for that. I wonder how they enclosed the surface with just plaster. And particularly novel here, except that it's all made out of brick. This reminds me of the latrine, public toilet plumbing system in the Athens Roman Agora. Notice in this column base we can see some metal. It looks like a filler for that hole. Is that original, would we wonder? Maybe of lead? Wonder what this made of mud is. It's protected well. There's no description for it. Cafe that I passed by on my way to and from the bus station. More modern day sculptures. This church on Agilu Street, which runs down into Emu, which I encounter many times in this area, walking towards Syntagma Square, but looked particularly pretty this morning in that sunlight. I think this church is on Evrodu or something like that. And to the right should be Syntagma Square. Should be, because I never know where I'm really at.